The ice cracked inside my son's glass, loud as a gunshot in the silent room. My hands rested flat on the cold mahogany table, the polished wood smooth and unyielding against my palms. Lauren's perfume hung in the air, thick and sweet, coating the back of my throat like spoiled honey. I sat in the house I built, at the table I bought, listening to my own flesh and blood agree that I was no longer fit to manage my own life. I am Arthur Pemberton, 68 years old, a retired educational publisher. I spent 4 decades building a legacy based on facts, precision, and clarity. And yet, my 40-year-old daughter-in-law was currently sliding a thick stack of medical and legal documents across the table. She wanted control of the $18 million scholarship legacy trust. She was calling me demented to get it. The stark white pages glared under the dining room chandelier. Lauren kept her voice pitched low and soft, adopting that gentle, patronizing tone people usually reserve for frightened children. She told the room that she was just so worried about my recent memory lapses, and her eyes shimmered with perfectly practiced concern. Matthew stared at his drink. My 41-year-old son, a man I had raised to know right from wrong, refused to meet my gaze. He simply nodded, along with his wife. "Maybe it is time to step down, Dad," Matthew mumbled to his glass. A heavy ache bloomed in my chest, cold and deep. I did not yell, nor did I try to defend my sanity. I just watched them. My attorney sat on my right. David had been my legal counsel for 20 years, and I could feel the rigid tension radiating from his suit jacket. He opened his mouth to object to Lauren's absurd claims, but I placed a hand on his forearm to stop him. Under the shadow of the table, I passed David a heavy, sealed manila folder. "Are you sure, Arthur?" David whispered, his voice barely carrying over the ambient hum of the air conditioner. "Keep it sealed," I murmured back. "Release the contents only during the formal board hearing, and only after the independent forensic audit is completely finished." David felt the weight of the envelope, looked at my calm expression, and slowly nodded. Lauren mistook my silence for confusion. A tight little smile of victory appeared on her face, and the woman reached out to pat my hand across the table. I pulled my arm back before her manicured fingers could make contact. Tucked inside the breast pocket of my jacket was my small leather notebook. For 3 months, I had been documenting every strange invoice, every altered scholarship record, and every suspicious public relations expense she had pushed through the foundation. My daughter-in-law thought my quiet evenings in the study were signs of a fading mind, but she had no idea I was tracking every penny she stole. I pushed my chair back from the table. The wood scraped loudly against the floor, making Matthew flinch and spill a drop of his drink. I stood up, adjusted my tie, and looked at the 2 people who thought they had just outsmarted an old man. I wished them a good evening, turned my back, and walked out the front door. The cool night air hit my face, finally clearing away the cloying smell of that perfume. I drove straight to the botanical gardens on the edge of town. My wife, Eleanor, had a stone bench dedicated in her name near the sleeping rose bushes. The granite was freezing to the touch, but I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle the dry autumn leaves. Eleanor and I had built the trust together to help kids who actually needed a chance in life. I ran my fingers over her engraved name, feeling the rough edges of the letters. I promised her I would not let Lauren turn our life's work into a personal piggy bank. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the wheels were already turning. The independent forensic audit quietly began in a downtown office, pulling bank statements and routing numbers from the shadows. Lauren believed she had cornered a helpless victim, and she truly thought the incapacity paperwork was a checkmate. But as I sat by the window in my study, drinking bitter black coffee and watching the morning frost melt off the glass, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The battle lines were drawn. I finally know who I cannot trust. 2 nights after the medical papers were slid across my dining table, Lauren stood under the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Hotel ballroom. She wore a conservative navy gown, and a photographer from the local paper snapped pictures as she wrapped an arm around my shoulder. Her grip was tight enough to bruise. "Smile for the camera, Akla," Lauren murmured, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth. "We want everyone to see how well you are doing." I smiled. Not for her, but for the flashbulbs. The annual Scholarship Legacy Trust Gala was supposed to celebrate the students, yet somehow, the evening had become a showcase for Lauren Pemberton. My son stood near the ice sculpture, nursing a scotch. Matthew smoothed his tie and looked at the floor when I caught his eye. He had been a good man once, before he traded his spine for a peaceful marriage. Later that evening, Lauren pulled a terrified high school senior onto the stage. The boy was supposed to be a scholarship recipient, but he looked like a prop in her one-woman play. She squeezed his shoulder, leaned into the microphone, and spoke to the wealthy donors in attendance. "Arthur and I are just so blessed to help these children," Lauren declared, pressing her hand over her heart, "especially now, as I take on more responsibilities to ensure his legacy is protected." I clapped along with the crowd, playing the part of the fading patriarch perfectly. My daughter-in-law thought she was building a cage for me. She did not realize I had already handed the key to the locksmith. The next morning, I sat in the corner booth of a diner 3 towns over. The coffee tasted like burnt copper, but the privacy was worth the drive. Across the scuffed laminate table sat Miriam Cole. Miriam used to run the largest preparatory academy in the state. Her posture was straight as a steel rod, and her dark eyes missed absolutely nothing. We had known each other for 20 years, and she was the only person outside the family who understood the true architecture of the trust. 20 years earlier, Eleanor insisted that the trust protector could never be a family member. She chose Miriam because she had spent her entire career protecting students instead of protecting family interests. "The forensic accountant found the bottom of the rabbit hole," Miriam said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. I opened the flap and pulled out copies of emails and wire transfers. Lauren had authorized payments to a media consulting group for gala promotions, which I already suspected. However, what the auditor uncovered was the name on the media group business license. "It is her maiden name," I said, tracing the signature on the page. "She hired her own shell company to run public relations for the charity. $480,000 over 3 years, Miriam added, taking a deliberate sip of her tea. "Lauren has been slowly bleeding the scholarship fund to finance her lifestyle." My stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. That money belonged to kids who needed books and meal plans. Instead, it bought designer bags and imported cars for a woman who already had plenty. Later that afternoon, Matthew came by the house to pick up some of his old golf clubs from the garage. The air smelled of motor oil and damp cardboard. I leaned against my workbench and watched my son inspect a pitching wedge, desperately wanting to give him one last chance to do the right thing. "Lauren has been spending a lot of time managing the trust accounts," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Are you sure she is not overwhelmed? There are always outside firms we could hire, so she could focus on her real job." Matthew stiffened, placed the club back in the bag, and wiped his hands on his jeans. He refused to look directly at me. "She is fine, Dad. She enjoys the work, and you do not need to worry about the finances anymore. I just want to make sure everything is above board," I pressed gently. "Sometimes, people get confused when family money mixes with charity." "Dad, stop." Matthew finally met my gaze, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "Lauren is just trying to help you. The doctors said you might start getting paranoid, so please do not make this harder than it has to be." He grabbed his golf bag and walked out to the driveway. I listened to his car engine start and fade down the street. I had offered my son a rope, and he chose to tie it around his own neck. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket just before dinner. The cheap plastic felt completely out of place in my tailored slacks, but I could not risk Lauren monitoring the home network. I pressed the green button, and the lead auditor began speaking immediately. "Mr. Pemberton," the voice crackled through the tiny speaker. "We dug into those public relations invoices you flagged, and the scope just changed entirely. Your daughter-in-law is not just overcharging the trust for services." "What else did you find?" I asked, gripping the edge of my desk. "She is approving inflated marketing contracts awarded to a related party public relations company she secretly controlled, and then routing the tuition grants directly into related party consulting accounts." The breath left my lungs. Skimming from marketing budgets was theft, but stealing the actual scholarships was an entirely different level of rot. The audit had just expanded from a civil dispute into a massive fraud investigation. I called Miriam immediately, and the phone rang twice before she answered. "They found more," I told her, my voice thick with a rage I had not felt in decades. "It is worse than we thought. Lauren is going to file that incapacity petition soon to lock me out before the annual board meeting." "Let her file it," Miriam said. Her tone was completely calm, devoid of any panic. "If she files it, she takes control of the checkbook," I argued, pacing across the hardwood floor of the study. "No, Arthur, she does not." The older woman paused, letting the silence stretch out heavily. "Keep playing the confused old man, and let her build her little throne. When the time comes, the trust will protect itself." The waiting room of the neurology clinic smelled of industrial bleach and stale magazine pages. My appointment was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and Lauren had insisted on driving me. She sat next to me on the stiff vinyl sofa, aggressively tapping her perfectly manicured nails against her leather handbag. Her foot bounced in a rapid, nervous rhythm. I just watched the second hand of the wall clock sweep past the 12, letting her stew in her own ambition. "We just want to make sure you are safe, Arthur," Lauren said, adjusting her designer scarf. Her voice dripped with that same artificial sweetness she used at the charity gala. "These tests are perfectly standard for someone your age." I offered a slow, agreeable nod. Miriam had told me to play the part, so I let my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch and stared blankly at the receptionist desk. A heavy wooden door opened, and a young nurse called my name. We walked down a long, overly bright corridor into an examination room where the air conditioning blew icy air directly onto my neck. Dr. Eris Thorne waited for us. He was a specialist my daughter-in-law had handpicked, a man known for his swift evaluations and expensive consultation fees. "Mr. Pemberton, please have a seat," Dr. Thorne said, gesturing to the examination chair. He barely looked up from his digital tablet. "Lauren mentioned you have been experiencing some significant memory lapses." "He forgot where he parked his car twice last month," Lauren interrupted, before I could open my mouth. "And he has been extremely confused about family finances. It is becoming a real danger to himself." The doctor finally looked at me, his pen poised over a notepad. I opened my mouth to give a measured response, but the clinic door swung open again. David, my personal attorney, stepped into the cramped room. Right behind him was a tall, severe-looking woman carrying a thick leather briefcase. Lauren stood up immediately, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "David, what are you doing here?" my daughter-in-law demanded, her voice losing all its practiced warmth. "This is a private medical evaluation. Under the state medical privacy statutes, Arthur is allowed to have his legal counsel present," David replied smoothly, setting his briefcase on the counter. "And because this evaluation was initiated to question his capacity as a fiduciary, we have brought Dr. Elena Rostova. She is an independent, court-certified neuropsychologist. She will be co-administering the exam today to ensure all legal baselines are properly documented." Lauren gripped the back of the visitor chair. Her knuckles turned stark white. She looked at Dr. Thorne, silently begging him to object, but the man simply adjusted his glasses and offered Dr. Rostova a Polita node. He knew better than to argue with a court-certified expert. For the next 2 hours, the room turned into a grueling gauntlet of cognitive puzzles. They asked me to remember lists of unrelated words, draw clock faces, and count backward from 100 by sevens. I did not fake anything. At 68 years old, my brain was not as quick as it had been at 30. I stumbled on a few of the word associations, and I genuinely forgot one of the delayed recall items. When they asked me complex hypothetical questions about financial risk, however, my mind snapped into sharp focus. I explained the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust with the precision of a man who had spent 4 decades in educational publishing. Lauren sat in the corner the entire time. Her eyes tracked every slight hesitation, every pause I took to gather my thoughts. Whenever I missed a word, a tiny, satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth. Finally, Dr. Rostova set her clipboard down on the metal tray. The sharp clatter echoed in the quiet room. She consulted quietly with Dr. Thorne for a few minutes while the air conditioner hummed above us. "Well," Dr. Rostova began, turning to face the room, "the results are quite clear. Mr. Pemberton, you are exhibiting signs of mild cognitive impairment. It is a normal part of the aging process for many individuals, and it explains the occasional forgetfulness." Lauren practically vibrated with excitement. She pulled her phone out of her purse, her thumbs hovering over the screen as if she were ready to text her lawyers that very second. "So he is impaired," Lauren said, her voice breathy and triumphant. "Thank you, doctor. That is exactly what we needed to know. We can take it from here to ensure his estate is properly managed." She grabbed her expensive handbag and moved toward the door, completely missing the look passing between my attorney and the independent examiner. "Mrs. Pemberton, please wait," Dr. Rostova said, her tone flat and authoritative. "You are misunderstanding the clinical definition. Mild cognitive impairment affects short-term recall. It does not equate to a loss of legal capacity." Lauren stopped with her hand on the brass doorknob. The triumphant smile froze on her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat and read directly from the screen. "Your father-in-law demonstrated exceptional executive function. According to our joint assessment, his testamentary capacity remains fully intact." His financial decision-making capacity is intact, and his capacity to serve as a trustee is intact. He is perfectly capable of managing his own affairs and his legal obligations. The silence in the room became absolute. I watched my daughter-in-law process the words. She had bet her entire strategy on a medical disqualification, and 2 doctors had just handed her a piece of paper that legally certified my competence. But Lauren was nothing if not stubborn. Her shock quickly morphed into a cold, desperate fury. She let go of the doorknob, pulled her phone back up, and dialed a number. "Get me the complete trust document," Lauren hissed into the receiver, glaring directly at me while ignoring the medical professionals in the room. "I do not care what the doctors say. We are filing the formal incapacity petition tomorrow morning." David stood next to the examination table and quietly buttoned his suit jacket. He did not say a word, but a small, knowing gleam appeared in his eyes. Lauren thought she was escalating the war. She had no idea she had just stepped directly into the trap. 48 hours after the clinic appointment, the autumn rain turned the city streets into slick gray mirrors. I sat inside the windowless conference room of a downtown accounting firm, listening to the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Marcus, the lead forensic auditor, stood at the head of a long mahogany table. He had spent the entire weekend pulling bank records from the foundation servers, and the results were spread out before me in neat, devastating piles. The room smelled of ozone and burned coffee, a sharp contrast to the sterile clinic where Lauren had tried to steal my independence. We subpoenaed the routing numbers and conducted a few quiet interviews with the commercial tellers, Marcus said, tapping a red pen against a thick stack of printed spreadsheets. "Your daughter-in-law was very careful with the small administrative accounts, but she got greedy with the major transfers." I picked up the top sheet, feeling the rough texture of the paper beneath my thumb. The document detailed exactly $480,000 in related party payments. Lauren had funneled the money through a media consulting group over the past 3 years, categorizing the theft as public relations expenses. She used her maiden name on the business license, hiding the shell company in plain sight. But the consulting fraud was only the surface. Marcus moved down the length of the table, his expression hardening. He slid a second folder toward me and opened it to reveal the grant disbursements for the fall semester. "She completely bypassed the standard applicant interviews," the accountant explained, pointing to a list of completely unfamiliar names. "Lauren bypassed the competitive scholarship review process and quietly approved grants through inflated consulting and outreach contracts awarded to a public relations company she secretly controlled. The money never went directly to students. Instead, it was diverted through related party invoices disguised as legitimate administrative expenses." The reality of her actions hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My jaw ached, and I realized I was grinding my teeth together. That money was meant for college tuition, textbooks, and meal plans for kids who had absolutely nothing. My wife and I had built the trust to change lives, and this woman was using it to finance her luxury cars and country club membership fees. I placed the paper back on the table, my hands trembling just slightly with restrained fury. I needed more than just bank statements to destroy her completely. I needed undeniable proof of her intent. I drove back to my house in complete silence, the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers the only sound in the car. When I finally pulled into the driveway, Matthew was waiting for me. His silver sedan was parked entirely too close to the garage door. My son stood on the covered front porch, holding a stack of delivered mail, and he looked entirely exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his expensive silk tie hung loose around his collar. "Matthew," I said, walking up the concrete steps and shaking the cold rain from my umbrella, "are you looking for something?" He held up a thick manila envelope, the top corner crumpled in his tight fist. "The postal worker left this in the wrong box," my son muttered, staring fixedly at the return address. "It is a returned scholarship check. Dad, do you remember a student named Sarah Jenkins?" I paused with my hand on the brass front door handle. I maintained my carefully constructed expression of mild confusion, furrowing my brow just enough to look uncertain. "Sarah? No, I do not think so. Did the board approve a grant for her?" Matthew looked down at the soaked envelope, his jaw tightening. "Lauren said you personally signed off on this application last week. She told me you were getting so forgetful. She had to push the paperwork through just to save time." He swallowed hard, looking genuinely sick to his stomach. "I drove past the mailing address on the way over here. It is an empty commercial lot next to an abandoned gas station." I let the heavy silence stretch out between us. The rain drummed against the porch roof, loud and relentless. I could see the desperate hope in his eyes. the silent plea for me to give him a logical explanation that would clear his wife of any wrongdoing. I refused to give him that comfort. My memory is simply not what it used to be, son, I said softly, unlocking the door and stepping into the warm foyer. You should probably ask your wife about it. She handles all the important paperwork these days. Matthew did not follow me inside. He just stood on the dark porch in the freezing cold, staring at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The absolute certainty he had shown at the family meeting was officially broken. Later that evening, I sat in the leather chair of my study, watching a small fire crackle in the stone hearth. The house felt massive and incredibly empty. Lauren was planning to formally file the bad faith incapacity petition the very next morning, confident she had neutralized me with the doctors. She thought she was only days away from taking total control of the $18 million trust. My hidden burner phone vibrated aggressively against the wooden desk, shattering the quiet atmosphere. I picked up the cheap plastic device and answered without saying a word. "Mr. Pemberton," Marcus said, his voice buzzing with adrenaline through the terrible speaker. The IT specialists finally cracked the administrative restrictions on the Foundation server. I leaned forward, gripping the armrest of my chair. What did they find? The auditor took a sharp breath. Lauren tried to wipe her tracks before the medical evaluation, but we recovered the deleted folders. We have her hidden emails. The fire popped loudly in the grate, throwing orange light across the room. She did not just authorize the fraudulent payments, Marcus continued, his words landing like heavy stones. She sent written instructions to her personal banker detailing exactly how to hide the stolen funds from the board of directors. Morning light filtered through the rain-streaked windows of my study, casting long gray shadows across the floorboards. The mahogany grandfather clock ticked a slow, steady rhythm in the corner, marking the seconds while I waited for the inevitable. Matthew arrived just before 10 o'clock, and he did not come alone. Lauren followed him into the room, wrapped in a beige cashmere trench coat that smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and damp wool. She carried her heavy leather designer bag, dropping it carelessly onto my vintage sofa before turning her attention to me. My son looked exactly as he had the night before. Dark circles framed his eyes, and his shoulders carried a heavy, exhausted slump. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled envelope bearing the fake Sarah Jenkins address, and tossed it onto my desk. The paper made a soft, damp smack against the wood. "Explain this, Lauren," Matthew demanded, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I drove out to the mailing address this morning. It is a vacant dirt lot next to a collapsed gas station." Lauren did not even blink. That practiced, sympathetic smile slid onto her face, as easily as slipping on a silk glove. She stepped closer to my desk, reaching out to tap her manicured fingernails against the ruined envelope. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed, casting a pitying look in my direction. "I told you Arthur was handling the outbound mail last week. His mind has been so terribly confused lately, and he must have copied the wrong address from the old Foundation files." Matthew turned his gaze to me, his eyes practically begging for a defense. He wanted me to argue, to prove his wife wrong, but I offered him absolutely nothing. My posture collapsed inward, and I let my hands tremble just a fraction of an inch against the armrests of my chair. "I just try to help out around here," I murmured, staring blankly at the edge of the rug. "Some days it takes me a little longer to sort through things than it used to." "I am sorry, Matthew." A thick, suffocating silence filled the room. Matthew rubbed the bridge of his nose, and I could see the memories warring in his head. The boy I raised remembered a father who never missed a single decimal point in the publishing company ledgers, yet he was staring at a man who was pretending to lose his grip on reality. Lauren's phone suddenly buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the glowing screen, and gave an irritated little huff. "I need to take this call from the gala committee," my daughter-in-law announced, already walking toward the hallway. "We will sort out your father's little mistake when I get back, honey." The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving us alone in the quiet study. Matthew paced in front of the bookshelves, his shoes scuffing against the rug. He looked at the framed photographs from his childhood, shaking his head slowly. "You used to memorize the entire roster for my Little League team, Dad," Matthew whispered, speaking more to himself than to me. "Batting averages, fielding errors, pitch counts. Now you cannot even read a basic zip code?" I kept my voice quiet and frail. "Check the top drawer of my desk, Matthew. The medical release forms from the neurology clinic are in there. Maybe you should read them." My son circled the heavy oak desk and grabbed the brass handle. He expected to find a doctor's note printed on sterile hospital paper, but instead, his fingers brushed against smooth, worn leather. Matthew pulled out my black notebook. He frowned, flipping open the cover. The pages were filled with my sharp, precise handwriting. I had documented every single wire transfer, every fake applicant profile, and every offshore routing number Lauren had used over the past 3 months. The dates were perfectly aligned, neatly cross-referenced with the Foundation bank statements. Matthew stopped breathing. His eyes darted back and forth across the pages, processing the undeniable proof of massive financial fraud. The handwriting did not belong to a demented old man, because it was the exact same meticulous script that had built a publishing empire. "You knew," Matthew whispered, the leather binding shaking in his grip. He looked up, his expression completely shattered. "You have known for months." I sat up straight. I slowly straightened my posture and met my son's eyes without saying another word, and I locked eyes with my son. The frail facade evaporated instantly, leaving only the cold reality of the situation in its wake. I stopped interrupting her the moment I realized she would eventually expose herself, I told him, my voice steady and hard as iron. "And I had to see if you would jump into the dirt with her." The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. He stared at the ledger, realizing his wife had weaponized his trust to steal money from helpless children. The foundation of his 12-year marriage crumbled right there in my study, dissolving into absolute dust. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Lauren was finishing her phone call, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Matthew shoved the notebook deep inside his jacket pocket, just as the door swung open. Lauren walked back in, completely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred in the room. She picked up her heavy handbag from the sofa, complaining about the catering company charging extra for table linens. "We should get going," Lauren said, adjusting her trench coat and looking at her reflection in the glass window. "I have a meeting downtown in 30 minutes. My son turned to face her, and a terrifyingly calm smile appeared on his face. He had inherited my ability to mask a war behind a polite expression. "Sure, honey," Matthew replied smoothly. "Give me your phone for a second. I need to text the mechanic about my car, and my battery is completely dead." Lauren handed it over without a single second thought, already walking toward the front door to check her makeup in the hall mirror. Matthew did not open a text message app. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive from his keychain. It was the exact kind of high-speed data cloner corporate auditors used for immediate extractions. He plugged the device directly into the charging port of her unlocked phone. A tiny green light blinked rapidly on the drive. I watched from my desk, completely silent, as my son stood 10 feet behind his wife and downloaded the entire contents of her digital life. The progress bar on the screen filled in a matter of seconds. He pulled the silver device free, slipped it back into his pocket, and casually handed the phone to Lauren as she turned around. "Thanks," Matthew said, opening the front door for her. They walked out into the rain, leaving me alone in the study. The trap was no longer just mine. My son had finally joined the hunt. Tuesday morning arrived with 3 sharp knocks against my heavy oak front door. Rain still coated the porch from the previous night, leaving the air smelling of wet asphalt and crushed pine needles. A young man in a damp windbreaker stood on the welcome mat, holding a thick stack of legal documents. "Arthur Pemberton?" the stranger asked, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. I nodded, accepting the heavy paper. The ink was still fresh enough to smudge against my thumb. Lauren had officially pulled the trigger. My daughter-in-law formally filed the bad faith incapacity proceedings with the county court. She did not wait for family consensus, and she certainly did not care about the truth. The paperwork claimed I was entirely unfit to manage my own daily affairs, let alone an $18 million charitable foundation. I closed the door, walked into the kitchen, and set the petition on the granite counter. I should have felt terrified or angry. Instead, a strange sense of profound calm settled over my shoulders. Lauren practically danced into the house 2 hours later. Her expensive heels clicked a victorious staccato rhythm against the hardwood floor. She had brought a guest with her, completely ignoring the fact that it was my home. Richard Vance, one of the junior foundation board members, followed my daughter-in-law into the living room, looking completely uncomfortable. My son remained entirely absent this morning. After cloning his wife's phone the previous night, Matthew had driven to a cheap motel out by the interstate, needing total isolation to process the absolute destruction of his 12-year marriage. That left Lauren free to operate without anyone looking over her shoulder. "It is just a formality, Richard," Lauren said, her voice floating down the hallway to where I stood completely out of sight. "Arthur is losing his grip on reality. We need you to testify at the preliminary hearing next week. Just tell the judge about the time he forgot the gala catering budget." "I do not know, Lauren," Richard muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. He seemed perfectly fine to me at the time. A heavy pause followed. I could practically see the sweet, poisonous smile forming on her face. The foundation is undergoing a major leadership transition, Lauren told him, her tone dropping an octave to convey a subtle but sharp threat. We are going to need loyal board members to help guide the new vision. I would hate to see you miss out on that opportunity just because you felt overly sentimental about an old man. She was actively coaching witnesses right in my own living room. My hands tightened into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms. Lauren thought the initial medical evaluation gave her absolute immunity to rewrite history however she saw fit. Later that afternoon, the rain finally stopped, leaving the sky a bruised purple. I drove across town to the law offices of David Sterling. The waiting room smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather bindings. David met me at the reception desk, grabbed my elbow, and guided me back to his private corner office. Miriam Cole was already sitting in the leather guest chair. The older woman wore a sharp gray blazer, and her dark eyes glittered with quiet, focused anticipation. She had been waiting for this exact day for over a decade. Miriam was already coordinating our tactical response, moving pieces on the board while Lauren was still celebrating her opening move. She filed the paperwork, I said, setting the court summons on the polished mahogany desk. David picked up the petition, adjusting his reading glasses. He scanned the first page, flipped to the second, and a slow, deep breath escaped his lungs. The attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping a silver pen against his chin. "This is exactly what we needed," David murmured, looking up at Miriam before turning his gaze to me. "Arthur, by submitting this specific legal request to the state, Lauren has activated the failsafe." "Explain the mechanics to me," I requested, settling into the empty chair next to Miriam. David opened a thick, leather-bound binder on his desk. It contained the original framework of the scholarship fund. My attorney confirmed that filing the petition automatically triggered a mandatory review under the governance provisions of the trust. He flipped to a tabbed section near the back of the binder. The pages were yellowed with age. Drafted over 20 years ago, when my wife and I first established the charity. When a beneficiary or family member attempts to forcefully remove the sole trustee through a legal incapacity claim, the standard chain of command is immediately suspended, David explained, tracing a line of text with his pen to prepare for the upcoming hearing. The petition activated an automatic binding review by the independent trust protector. Lauren believed she was going to face a local judge who would just glance at a medical chart and hand over the keys to the kingdom. She had absolutely no idea that the real power had just shifted entirely out of the legal system and directly into this very room. Miriam smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. As the designated trust protector, I now have absolute authority to audit the challenger. Lauren just gave me the legal right to pull every single financial record she has touched over the last 3 years. I looked at the original trust document. The paper was heavy, carrying the weight of my late wife and her brilliant, paranoid foresight. Eleanor had always known that money attracted vultures, so she built a cage out of ink and legal clauses to trap anyone who tried to pick our bones clean. "What happens at the hearing next week?" I asked, looking back at my lawyer. David smiled after reading one specific paragraph outlining the severe consequences of a bad faith challenge. It was not a polite, professional expression. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a man who is about to legally dismantle someone's entire life. "We let her walk into the courtroom," David said, closing the heavy binder with a loud, definitive thud. "We let her present her fake evidence. We let her lie under oath. And then we locked the door behind her." The mahogany benches in courtroom 4 felt as rigid as church pews. Dust motes drifted through the shafts of morning light filtering through the tall, frosted windows. I sat beside my attorney, David, keeping my hands folded neatly on the defense table. Across the aisle, Lauren wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet, conservative wealth. She leaned close to her high-priced litigator, whispering something with a confident, razor-thin smile. My daughter-in-law genuinely believed she was walking into a coronation. She had no idea the gallows were already built. Matthew sat in the gallery right behind his wife. My 41-year-old son looked completely hollowed out, carrying the terrible weight of the digital evidence he had extracted 2 days prior. He did not look at Lauren, and he certainly did not look at me. He just stared straight ahead, listening to the heavy wooden door swing shut. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge took his seat at the elevated bench. The proceeding began with a dull crack of a wooden gavel. Lauren's attorney stood up immediately, painting a tragic picture of a failing patriarch. He paced in front of the judge, talking about my supposed memory lapses while using words like heartbreaking and necessary. I let him spin his fabricated narrative, maintaining a completely neutral expression. When he finally finished his opening statement, he returned to his seat, looking extremely satisfied. Then David called Dr. Elena Rostova to the witness stand. The court-certified neuropsychologist settled into the wooden chair, adjusting the microphone with a sharp burst of static. The air conditioning kicked on, sending a chill through the silent room. "Doctor, based on your joint evaluation last week, does Mr. Pemberton require a legal guardian?" David asked, his voice echoing cleanly off the wood-paneled walls. "Absolutely not," Dr. Rostova replied. "While he exhibits minor, age-appropriate memory delays, his executive function is exceptional. His testamentary and financial decision-making capacities remain completely intact. Mr. Pemberton is fully capable of managing his own legal affairs." A low murmur rippled through the small gallery. Lauren's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, angry clenching of her jaw. She frantically grabbed a gold pen and began scribbling furious notes to her lawyer, pressing so hard the paper nearly tore. Her litigator stood up to object, stammering about a second opinion, but the judge simply waved him down. The medical facts were already entered into the official public record. Before the opposition could regroup and launch a desperate cross-examination, David pulled a thick, bound folder from his leather briefcase. This was the exact moment we shifted from defense to offense. "Your Honor," David announced, walking toward the bench, "we submit that this petition was not filed out of familial concern. It is a bad faith maneuver designed to seize control of the $18 million Scholarship Legacy Trust. To prove this, we request to enter into evidence the findings of an independent forensic audit, completed just yesterday." Lauren shot out of her chair, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. Her attorney scrambled to catch up to his client's rising panic, shouting an objection. He argued that this was a capacity hearing, not a financial tribunal, and claimed the foundation accounts had zero relevance to the current proceeding. The judge peered over his reading glasses, looking back and forth between the two tables. "I will allow it, counsel," he grumbled. "If there is a massive financial motive behind questioning a man's sanity, I want to hear about it." David handed the printed spreadsheets to the bailiff. He did not rush, letting the terrible silence stretch out and wrap tightly around my daughter-in-law's throat. "The audit confirms that Mrs. Pemberton utilized a hidden shell company to siphon approximately $480,000 from the charity over 3 years," my attorney stated clearly, making sure every single syllable landed. Furthermore, she intercepted internal foundation emails, replaced legitimate scholarship applicants with fabricated profiles, and routed the tuition funds directly into related party vendor accounts. Matthew closed his eyes in the gallery. Even though he had already seen the digital copies on his own computer, hearing the theft laid out in a court of law was a completely different kind of agony. Sitting there under the fluorescent lights, he finally realized the sheer volume of documents his wife had concealed from him over their 12-year marriage. The deception was not a mistake, and it was certainly not an accident. It was a dedicated career. Lauren lost her composure entirely. Her face turned a mottled, furious red, and she slammed her hands flat down on the plaintiff table. "That is a complete lie," she screamed, abandoning her carefully crafted persona of the worried relative. "He is demented. He authorized those payments himself, and simply forgot, because his brain is rotting. You cannot trust a word this crazy old man says." The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but Lauren was already drowning in her own panic. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. The courtroom fell completely silent, waiting for the confused old man to finally crumble under the intense pressure. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice steady, calm, and perfectly measured, "I did not authorize those payments. I did, however, document every single one of them in my personal ledger the moment I suspected fraud. I allowed this ridiculous proceeding to occur today because I needed Mrs. Pemberton to officially perjure herself on the public record." Lauren stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization hit her all at once. I was not a victim, and I was never confused. The judge did not even need to retreat to his chambers to deliberate. He reviewed the medical certification, glanced at the damning audit summary, and tossed Lauren's petition onto his desk with a look of absolute disgust. "Petition denied," the judge declared, his voice hard and uncompromising. "Mr. Pemberton retains his full legal rights and remains the sole trustee. Mrs. Pemberton, considering the financial evidence submitted today, The financial allegations presented today fall outside the scope of this proceeding. They may, however, be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. We are adjourned." The gavel struck the sounding block for the final time. Lauren collapsed into her chair, utterly defeated. Matthew stood up, turned his back on his wife without uttering a single word, and walked out the heavy double doors into the hallway. The trap had snapped shut, but the punishment was not completely over. David packed the audit papers back into his briefcase, turned toward my daughter-in-law's trembling legal team, and delivered the final blow. "Mrs. Pemberton," my attorney said, his voice ringing with cold authority across the empty aisle. "As my client officially remains in power, I am formally requesting an emergency board meeting to convene tomorrow morning under the governance of the original trust instrument. We have one last envelope to open." The foundation boardroom occupied the top floor of a glass high-rise overlooking the harbor. Wednesday morning brought a bitter coastal wind that rattled the heavy window panes, but inside, the air was entirely stagnant. 7 members of the board of directors sat around a massive oval table, their faces pale and drawn. No one touched the silver coffee carafes or the arranged pastries. I sat at the head of the table in my usual leather chair, keeping my hands folded calmly on the polished wood. David, my attorney, stood near the projector screen, holding the heavy manila envelope I had given him weeks ago. Lauren arrived 10 minutes late, aggressively pushing open the frosted glass doors. She wore oversized dark sunglasses to hide her bloodshot eyes, and her usual perfectly styled hair looked slightly uneven. My 40-year-old daughter-in-law walked to the far end of the table and collapsed into a chair, glaring at the board members as if daring them to speak. "This meeting is completely out of order," Lauren snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "The court ruling yesterday was a temporary setback. I am filing an immediate appeal, and Arthur's medical condition is still under active medical review." David did not even look at her. He placed the sealed envelope directly in the center of the table, running his thumb over the wax seal. "Mrs. Pemberton, your appeal means absolutely nothing here," my attorney said, his voice calm and methodical. "The bad faith incapacity petition you filed triggered an automatic internal review. As the court confirmed, Mr. Pemberton's capacity, we are now executing the final mandate of the original trust instrument." Miriam Cole sat 2 seats down from me, her posture impossibly straight. She had remained entirely silent since walking into the room, just watching Lauren with the cold, unblinking intensity of a hawk preparing to strike. "What mandate?" Lauren demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "I am the senior financial officer. I know every single clause in the bylaws." "You know the bylaws of the operating foundation," I corrected her softly. "You do not know the rules of the trust itself." David broke the wax seal. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. He pulled out a thick stack of aged, heavy bond paper and began passing copies down the length of the table. "This is the original trust document, drafted 20 years ago by Arthur and Eleanor Pemberton," David explained, keeping a master copy for himself. "If you turn to page 47, you will find the Trust Protector Clause. In the event of a fiduciary challenge, absolute authority transfers to the designated protector." Lauren scrambled for a copy, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the first 3 pages onto the floor. She ignored them, flipping wildly through the rest of the packet. "The protector is Miriam Cole," David continued, gesturing toward the older woman. Miriam did not smile. She simply adjusted her reading glasses and pulled a second folder from her briefcase. "As trust protector, I authorized an independent forensic audit of all foundation accounts," Miriam announced, her voice echoing with decades of quiet authority. "The findings confirm that Lauren Pemberton engaged in massive self-dealing, siphoning approximately $480,000 through related party payments. Furthermore, she committed systematic self-dealing and charitable fund diversion by intercepting scholarship funds intended for minor beneficiaries." "That audit is illegal," Lauren shouted, slamming her hands on the table. "You had no right to access my personal banking information." "I did not access your personal banking information," a new voice said. The heavy glass doors opened again. Matthew walked into the boardroom, wearing the exact same suit he had worn the day before. He looked like he had not slept in a week. My son walked slowly around the edge of the table, avoiding his wife's frantic, desperate gaze entirely. "I gave them the information, Lauren," Matthew said, stopping right behind Miriam's chair. "I exported the email archive and accounting records you left open on your work laptop. Every consulting contract, every invoice approval, every internal budget revision, and every email discussing the related party vendor. I turned everything over to the forensic auditors the same night." I turned everything over to the forensic auditors the moment I found it. They told me it confirmed the financial patterns they had already uncovered. Lauren stared at her husband, the blood draining completely from her face. Her mouth fell open, but absolutely no sound came out. The woman who had spent 3 years manipulating everyone around her finally realized she had been outplayed by the very man she thought was completely under her control. "Let us move to the bad faith incapacity clause," David instructed, redirecting the stunned room back to the legal documents. "Because, Mrs. Pemberton utilized the court system to attempt a hostile takeover based on fabricated medical claims. A permanent disqualification is automatically enacted." The attorney leaned forward, making sure every board member heard the next sentence clearly. "Neither Lauren nor Matthew Pemberton can ever hold a fiduciary role within this trust again," David stated, closing the master copy. "You are permanently removed from all foundation boards, committees, and advisory councils, effective immediately." "You cannot do this to me," Lauren shrieked, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at my face. "I built the public image of this charity. I brought in the wealthy donors. You owe me that money for all the extra hours I worked." I looked at the woman who had tried to steal my mind, my dignity, and my late wife's entire legacy. I felt absolutely no pity for her. "You never owned the charity, Lauren," I told her, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "You were just an employee, and you are officially fired." Miriam slid one final piece of paper across the table toward my daughter-in-law. "This is a formal demand for restitution," the trust protector explained coldly. "You have 30 days to repay the $480,000 you stole. If the funds are not returned in full by that deadline, I will personally hand the forensic audit over to the criminal division of the IRS." Lauren stood frozen, staring down at the restitution demand as if it were a live grenade. She had gambled an $18 million trust against the perceived weakness of an old man, and she had lost absolutely everything. The boardroom remained completely silent as my daughter-in-law picked up her heavy designer bag, turned around, and walked out of the glass doors for the final time. By Friday afternoon, the fallout began to spread like a toxic spill through Lauren's carefully curated professional life. The state attorney general's office formally opened a charitable trust inquiry, freezing every single foundation account tied to her name. They sent 2 plainclothes investigators to the PR firm she had secretly owned, confiscating hard drives and boxing up years of financial ledgers. Word travels incredibly fast in the small circles of old money and charity galas. I sat on my back patio, watching a pair of blue jays fight over a sunflower seed near the oak tree. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, dry scent of falling autumn leaves. My phone had been ringing constantly all morning. Half of the calls were from panicked board members trying to distance themselves from the scandal, and the other half were from local reporters smelling blood in the water. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. Around 2 o'clock, a familiar silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Matthew stepped out of the car, moving with the stiff, careful precision of a man recovering from a terrible physical accident. He walked around to the back patio and stood at the edge of the flagstone, looking completely out of place in his wrinkled suit jacket and untucked shirt. "The IRS just notified Lauren about the comprehensive tax review," my son said, his voice flat and exhausted. "Because the forensic audit uncovered substantial, undisclosed related party payments and potential reporting violations, the IRS has opened a civil tax compliance review alongside the Attorney General's charitable trust investigation." Her 3 biggest PR clients terminated their contracts this morning before the news even hit the local papers. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the bitter warmth slide down my throat. I did not offer him a seat, and I did not offer him comfort. "She brought it entirely on herself," I replied quietly. Matthew looked down at his expensive leather shoes. The silence between us stretched out, heavy with the weight of the last 3 months. He had chosen his wife over his father at the dining room table, fully willing to strip away my independence based on a handful of convenient lies. "I am sorry, Dad," Matthew finally whispered, his voice cracking just slightly. "I should have known you were not losing your mind. I should have looked at the foundation numbers myself instead of just taking her word for it. I was a coward, and I betrayed you." The apology hung in the crisp autumn air. It was genuine, rooted in deep shame and absolute regret. But 40 years of raising this boy had taught me that immediate forgiveness rarely builds permanent character. "You did betray me, Matthew," I agreed, setting my ceramic mug down on the wrought iron table. "You let a woman you barely knew for a decade convince you that the man who raised you was suddenly entirely incompetent. You watched her hand me medical paperwork designed to lock me away, and you nodded along." He flinched, closing his eyes tightly against the words. I cannot fix what I did, my son admitted, his hands trembling at his sides. But I have filed for divorce. I packed my things and moved into a rental apartment across town. I am not asking you to forget what happened, Dad. I am just asking for a chance to earn my way back into your life. I looked at him for a long time. The anger that had sustained me through the medical tests, the grueling audits, and the courtroom battles slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion. You can start by driving me to the community center on Monday, I told him, picking up my coffee mug again. Miriam is restructuring the entire foundation governance, and we have a lot of work to do. Matthew let out a shaky breath, offering a small, grateful nod. He understood the boundary I had just drawn. We were not instantly healed, but the door was no longer locked. The following week, the local papers finally published the details of the foundation audit. Lauren's professional reputation shattered overnight. The society pages that had once praised her charity work now detailed the exact mechanics of her wire fraud. She lost her country club membership, her seat on the museum advisory board, and every shred of social influence she had spent 12 years ruthlessly acquiring. I did not celebrate her downfall. The revenge felt necessary to protect the trust, but watching a family tear itself apart is never a joyful experience. On Thursday evening, I drove to the botanical gardens as the sun began to set over the harbor. The sky burned a brilliant, bruised orange, casting long shadows across the dormant rose bushes. I walked down the gravel path until I reached the granite bench dedicated to my late wife. The stone was cold against my hand. I sat down, listening to the distant hum of city traffic, and thought about the $18 million sitting safely in the restructured trust. The money was finally secure, protected from the very people who were supposed to inherit it. "We won, Eleanor," I whispered to the empty air. "The kids are going to get their scholarships, and the foundation is completely clean." I pulled my small leather notebook from my breast pocket. The pages were full of numbers, dates, and the awful evidence of my daughter-in-law's greed. I did not need it anymore. I dropped the heavy ledger into a nearby trash can, leaving the terrible weight of the last few months behind me. I had one final announcement to make, and I needed to prepare for the future. 2 months later, the local university auditorium smelled intensely of lemon floor wax and fresh lilies. Hundreds of folding chairs scraped against the polished hardwood as families filed into the massive room. The ambient noise of the crowd swelled into a loud, echoing hum. I stood in the wings just off the main stage, staying completely out of the bright theatrical lights. My hands rested on a thick blue leather folder, and the smooth material felt heavy with absolute finality. Out in the main hall, a man in a simple white button-down shirt carried a heavy cardboard box of bottled water toward the refreshment tables. He had rolled his sleeves up past his elbows, and a dark patch of sweat stained the center of his back. Matthew did not wear a silk tie today, nor did he carry a smartphone to check his corporate emails. My 41-year-old son was currently taking orders from a 20-something event coordinator, nodding respectfully as she pointed toward the empty ice coolers. He was slowly beginning the long process of rebuilding trust through quiet, manual volunteer service. The arrogance that had blinded him at my dining room table was entirely gone, replaced by a grounded, painful humility. David Sterling walked up beside me in the shadows of the stage wings, holding his familiar battered briefcase. My attorney watched Matthew haul another case of water across the room, offering a slow, approving nod. "The final wire transfer cleared the escrow account an hour ago," David said, keeping his voice pitched below the roar of the crowd. "Lauren managed to liquidate her retirement portfolios and sell her designer assets just in time. She was required to repay the improper financial benefits in full to satisfy the trust protector's demand." I kept my gaze fixed on the crowded room. And the legal fallout? Her professional reputation collapsed completely after the public audit findings hit the local business journals. The lawyer adjusted his lapels, looking entirely satisfied with his handiwork. She lost her firm, her clients, and her social standing. More importantly, the Attorney General ensured she is permanently removed from every fiduciary position in this state. The Attorney General's office permanently barred her from serving as a fiduciary, officer, or director of any charitable organization under its jurisdiction. Lauren had lost all her influence, but she was not unrealistically imprisoned. The total destruction of her pristine public image and the total loss of her wealth were far worse punishments for a woman who valued status above oxygen. The overhead auditorium lights dimmed abruptly, plunging the audience into an expectant hush. Miriam Cole stepped up to the wooden podium at the center of the stage. The older woman tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thumps echoing clearly through the speaker system. It was time to finish the work Eleanor and I had started 20 years ago. I walked out from the wings, the wooden floorboards creaking slightly under my dress shoes. The bright stage lights felt hot against my face, blinding me to the hundreds of people sitting in the dark rows. I joined Miriam at the podium and opened the blue leather folder. Inside rested a brand new governance charter, printed on thick, heavy bond paper. I pulled a fountain pen from my breast pocket and unscrewed the brass cap. I did not hesitate. I pressed the steel nib to the paper and signed my name on the bottom line, permanently relinquishing my absolute authority over the $18 million foundation. I voluntarily retired from my position, completing the transition just as I had planned. I handed the pen to Miriam, and she signed the document right next to my signature. The Independent Community Board officially assumed permanent control of the entire scholarship legacy. My family no longer held the keys to the vault, ensuring that no greedy relative could ever weaponize the funds again. The audience erupted into a massive wave of applause. I looked out into the crowd, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the stage lights. Way in the back of the auditorium, hovering near the glass exit doors, stood a solitary figure. She wore a plain gray raincoat, completely devoid of the expensive jewelry and tailored suits she used to flaunt at charity galas. Lauren watched the ceremony from the outside, standing in the cold shadows of the vestibule. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked incredibly small. My former daughter-in-law lingered just long enough to see me hand over the foundation she had desperately tried to steal, and then she turned around and pushed through the heavy doors, disappearing into the rainy night forever. Miriam took the microphone and began calling names from a printed list. One by one, teenagers walked up the wooden stairs to the stage. These were the real students, the desperate kids who had been erased from the system so a greedy woman could finance a luxury lifestyle. A young girl named Emily Carter approached the podium. She wore a simple, faded yellow dress, and her hands shook violently as she reached out to me. I handed her a thick white envelope containing her fully funded college tuition grant. Sarah clutched the paper to her chest, tears spilling freely over her cheeks. She leaned in close to the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton," the teenager whispered, her voice trembling with absolute gratitude. "Thank you for changing my life." I smiled, a deep, resonant warmth filling my chest. I gently shook my head and pointed toward the massive banner hanging directly above the stage. "Do not thank me, Emily," I told her, my voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "Thank Eleanor." I stepped back from the bright lights and quietly watched the young scholarship recipient receive an award created in memory of my late wife. The applause washed over me, loud and continuous. My joints ached, and the long war had certainly taken a heavy physical toll on my 68-year-old body, but my mind was perfectly clear. The legacy now belonged exclusively to the community, rather than the family. Eleanor's dream was finally safe, protected by a cage of ironclad ink, and no one would ever question my stewardship again. When you spend decades building a life, pouring your sweat and devotion into a foundation meant to outlast you, you naturally assume your family will protect that legacy. You teach your children the difference between right and wrong, hoping they will build their own lives with partners who share those exact same values. But sometimes, the greatest threat to your peace does not come from a stranger at the front door. It sits right at your dining room table, drinking your coffee and smiling directly into your face while calculating the exact value of your demise. The journey of Arthur Pemberton teaches a profound, undeniable lesson about trust and entitlement. You learn that blood and marriage do not automatically grant someone unrestricted access to your resources. True stewardship must always be earned through unwavering integrity, not simply demanded through a family title. There is an incredibly specific cruelty in watching someone weaponize your age against you. Society frequently tries to tell you that growing older means fading quietly into the background and surrendering your hard-earned autonomy to a younger generation. Manipulative people rely heavily on that societal assumption. They count on your silence to cover their tracks. They bank on the arrogant hope that you will be too tired or simply too polite to fight back when they attempt to strip away your dignity. However, as this story demonstrates, aging does not erase your intellect, and a quiet demeanor is never a true sign of weakness. When you face someone actively trying to gaslight you out of your own life's work, your absolute greatest weapon is the undeniable clarity of your own mind. You do not ever have to raise your voice to win a war against greed. You simply have to keep your eyes wide open, document the truth, and patiently wait for the arrogant to destroy themselves with their own hubris. Protecting your legacy also requires making the most agonizing choices a parent can ever face. When you see your own grown child enabling toxic behavior, turning a blind eye to massive deception just to maintain a fragile peace in their own home, your heart absolutely breaks. You desperately want to shield them from the pain, just as you did when they were young. But true love sometimes looks like a firmly closed door. You have to let them feel the full, crushing weight of their poor decisions. Shielding them from the truth only makes you complicit in the lie. 1 year later, as the dust finally settles and the consequences become permanent, you realize that true healing can only begin when everyone is forced to stand in the harsh light of accountability. Ultimately, your legacy is not defined by the money in your bank accounts. Your legacy is the positive impact you leave on the community and the rigid boundaries you enforce to protect that good work. You have the absolute right to secure your own peace. You have the right to demand respect in your own home, and you have the power to ensure your life serves a noble purpose rather than feeding unearned greed. We all reach a critical point where we have to finally decide who gets to sit at our table and who needs to be permanently shown the door. Have you ever had to draw a painful but necessary boundary with a family member to protect your own peace and dignity? And how did you find the strength to finally say, enough is enough?